A satellite passes silently over the Bay of Naples, its radar beam bouncing off the Earth's surface and back up into orbit, capturing a measurement precise enough to detect ground movement smaller than the width of a coin. When scientists processed the data from repeated passes over this exact stretch of coastline between January 2021 and May 2024, the resulting image showed something that looks almost like a target, a bullseye pattern of concentric rings radiating outward from a single point. Now that point, the dead center of the most intense ground uplift measured anywhere in the Campi Flegrei caldera, doesn't sit on land at all. It sits roughly 500 meters offshore, underwater, southwest of the old Pozzuoli fortress known as Rione Terra. The literal epicenter of the ground, rising beneath one of Europe's most dangerous volcanic systems, is sitting quietly beneath the waves of the Bay of Naples. And new research is now showing exactly how that hidden underwater uplift is physically reshaping the coastline itself, one earthquake at a time. I need you to understand why this is genuinely new, important data, not just another update on a volcano we've already covered on this channel. We've talked before about the magnitude 4.7 earthquake that struck Campi Flegrei on the evening of July 31st, the strongest recorded there in 40 years, and about the broader Brady Schism cycle that's been driving this caldera's unrest since 2005. What's new is the satellite and GPS data scientists have since used to measure exactly what that seismic activity is actually doing to the physical shape of the land and coastline itself, and a separate, freshly published model that's found something genuinely striking about how these earthquakes and the ground's rising are mathematically linked. So today we're going to dig into that data specifically, what the satellite radar imagery actually shows, what a similar smaller earthquake back in 2024 revealed about how these quakes permanently reshape the coast, the remarkable historical proof, visible in ancient Roman ruins, that this exact stretch of coastline has done this before, and a brand new scientific model published just months ago that's changed how researchers think about predicting this caldera's next move. Let's start with the satellite technology itself, because it's worth understanding how scientists can even measure something this precise from orbit. The method is called INSAR, short for Interferometric Synthetic Aperture Radar, and it works by comparing the radar signal a satellite bounces off the ground on one pass against the signal from a later pass over the exact same location, measuring the tiny differences in how long that signal took to return. Because radar wavelengths are so short, this technique can detect ground movement down to fractions of a centimeter, accumulated and mapped across an enormous area, all without a single instrument ever needing to physically touch the ground being measured. When researchers applied this technique to Campi Flegrei, converting years of repeated satellite passes into a map of mean vertical ground velocity, the resulting image showed that unmistakable bullseye pattern, concentric rings of increasing uplift converging on a single center point, with that center having risen approximately 14 centimeters between January 2021 and May 2024 alone. Here's where the story gets genuinely more interesting, because that satellite data isn't the only tool researchers have used to pin down exactly where this uplift is centered. Ground-based GPS stations, particularly one specific station called RITE, positioned at Rione Terra in Pozzuoli, have been recording continuous, high-precision vertical position data for years. When scientists mathematically invert that GPS data, essentially working backward from the pattern of ground movement recorded at multiple stations to calculate the most likely location of the underlying source, the result places the center of this uplift bell, as researchers call it, roughly 500 meters out into the sea, southwest of Rione Terra. That's not a small technical footnote. It means the actual heart of Campi Flegrei's current unrest sits directly beneath the waters of the Bay of Naples, with a visible uplift on land representing the outer edge of a much larger deformation pattern whose true center nobody can walk to because it's underwater. Now let's connect this directly to actual earthquake activity, because a separate, detailed scientific study specifically analyzed what happens to the ground when one of these Campi Flegrei earthquakes actually strikes. Back on May 20th, 2024, the caldera produced what was, at the time, the largest local earthquake ever instrumentally recorded there, a magnitude 4.4 event that caused substantial damage and forced the evacuation of tens of buildings west of the epicenter. Researchers who later analyzed the seismic waveforms from that earthquake in detail, reconstructing exactly how the underlying fault rupture unfolded, modeled the ground displacement that earthquake actually produced, and found something worth sitting with carefully. The predicted ground displacement pattern from that single earthquake showed an almost circular subsidence, a sinking rather than the broader uplift pattern the caldera has shown overall, centered just south of the Solfatara crater, and extending all the way out to the coastline itself. Remarkably, even though this earthquake-specific subsidence pattern was, in the researchers' own words, 2 orders of magnitude smaller than the broader deformation trend, its shape was strikingly similar to a separate, larger geodetic anomaly satellites had already detected accumulating over the preceding 5 years, a roughly 10-centimeter uplift deficit that had been locally disrupting the caldera's usual, smoother bell-shaped deformation pattern. What that finding actually tells you is genuinely significant. Individual earthquakes at Campi Flegrei aren't just shaking buildings and rattling nerves. They're leaving a measurable physical imprint on the shape of the ground itself, a signature that satellite radar can detect and that matches, in miniature, the same broader deformation pattern building up across the entire caldera over years. The ground isn't simply rising, uniformly, like a slowly inflating balloon. It's rising and locally subsiding in complex, earthquake-linked patterns that researchers are only now able to map with this level of precision, and that pattern reaches directly to the coastline, the literal boundary between land and sea, every single time. If all of this sounds like an entirely modern phenomenon, something only detectable because of satellites and GPS stations that didn't exist a century ago, there's a genuinely remarkable historical counterpoint worth knowing, because this exact coastline has been doing this, visibly, for thousands of years. In 1828, the pioneering geologist Charles Lyell visited Campi Flegrei and examined a site sitting almost precisely in the middle of the modern caldera, an ancient Roman structure long popularly known as the Temple of Serapis, though archaeologists now identify it more accurately as the Macellum of Pozzuoli, a Roman-era marketplace rather than a temple at all. What Lyell documented there became one of the most famous case studies in the entire history of geology. Several of the structure's ancient marble columns bear clear, unmistakable boring holes made by a specific type of marine mollusk that only bores into submerged wood or stone, found partway up the column's height, well above their base. That physical evidence proves, undeniably, that this structure was built on dry land, subsequently sank low enough for its lower columns to sit fully submerged in seawater, long enough for marine creatures to bore into them, and then rose again, lifting those bored, barnacle-scarred columns back up out of the water to where visitors can see them today. This single site, sitting directly in the bullseye center of the modern satellite deformation map we discussed earlier, is physical, ancient proof that Campi Flegrei's ground has been rising and sinking, submerging and re-emerging the coastline around it for the entire span of recorded human history in this exact location. Now let's get to the genuinely newest piece of this puzzle, a study published just this past February that's changed how scientists think about the relationship between this ongoing uplift and the earthquakes it produces. Researchers built what they're calling a deformation-driven earthquake interaction model, specifically designed to explain how Campi Flegrei's earthquake swarms actually relate to its ground deformation. Their central finding is worth stating plainly. Earthquake swarms at this caldera are governed by cumulative ground uplift, not simply by the passage of time. In other words, it's not that earthquakes are statistically more likely the longer this current unrest cycle continues in some abstract calendar-based sense. It's that the actual physical amount of ground that has risen, the cumulative total of that uplift, appears to directly govern how much seismicity results, following a specific, mathematically describable relationship. The research team combined 2 distinct approaches, a long-term model based on stress shadowing and loading interacting with the friction along Campi Flegrei's fault structures, with a shorter-term model treating earthquake clustering as overlapping aftershock sequences, similar in concept to the aftershock decay patterns we've discussed with other earthquake sequences on this channel. Merging those 2 approaches into a single combined model, the researchers found it could effectively reproduce the observed pattern of seismicity across nearly 2 decades of data, and, more importantly, for anyone trying to actually plan. Around this hazard, the model demonstrated it could provide genuine, probabilistic short-term forecasts of both earthquake rates and likely maximum magnitudes going forward. That's a meaningfully different, more sophisticated tool than simply tracking a running tally of months since the unrest began. If seismicity genuinely tracks cumulative uplift rather than elapsed time, then the single most important number to watch going forward isn't a calendar date. It's the total uplift figure itself, and specifically whether that uplift's rate of accumulation continues, accelerates, or finally begins to slow. As of early this year, that rate stood at roughly 10 millimeters per month, part of a cumulative total exceeding 140 centimeters, nearly 4.5 feet, of ground rise near Pozzuoli since this current unrest cycle began back in 2005. It's worth putting that number in historical perspective too, because Campi Flegrei has produced even larger cumulative uplift totals before without erupting. During the well-documented 1983 to 1984 Brady seismic crisis, the central caldera area recorded a total uplift of 1.8 meters, nearly 6 feet, accompanied by more than 16,000 recorded earthquakes. a genuinely staggering number, all without the volcano actually erupting. That historical precedent is a genuinely important, honest counterweight to any instinct to treat this new deformation data as evidence of an imminent eruption. Campi Flegrei has demonstrated, within recent living memory, that it's capable of sustaining truly enormous cumulative ground, movement, and seismic energy release, while ultimately settling back down without a volcanic event actually occurring. I want to be precise here about exactly what this new data does and doesn't tell us, because that distinction matters enormously. INGV's own official framing of the current situation describes it as intensifying unrest and uplift, explicitly not an imminent eruption. The satellite and GPS data we've walked through today confirms, with genuinely impressive precision, that real, measurable, physically significant ground deformation is occurring, that it's centered offshore beneath the bay, and that individual earthquakes like July's magnitude 4.7 event and 2024's magnitude 4.4 event are leaving their own detectable imprint on that deformation pattern, extending all the way to the coastline. What this data does not do is provide any new evidence that magma is actively moving toward the surface, which remains the specific, separate signal scientists would need to see before treating this as a genuine eruption warning rather than an intensifying but still fundamentally bradyseismic unrest episode. So what should you actually take from all of this? If you live in or have plans to visit the Campi Flegrei region, here's what genuinely matters. First, understand that the permanent shift in this story refers to real, confirmed, satellite-measured ground deformation extending to the coastline, a genuinely significant scientific finding, but one that INGV itself continues to classify as unrest and uplift rather than eruption precursor. Second, if you're interested in tracking this yourself, the cumulative uplift figure, not simply the earthquake count or the calendar date, is now understood to be the more scientifically meaningful number to watch, given this year's new deformation-driven modeling research. Third, the roughly 500,000 people living inside Italy's officially designated Campi Flegrei Red Zone remain covered by an established civil protection evacuation plan, and that framework continues operating under a yellow or attention level alert as of the most recent assessments, a status that reflects intensifying unrest without indicating an imminent crisis. And fourth, if this story genuinely fascinates you, the Macellum of Pozzuoli itself is open to visitors. A genuinely remarkable opportunity to stand inside the actual historical evidence of exactly the phenomenon. Modern satellites are now measuring with millimeter precision, thousands of years after the columns themselves first recorded it in stone. So here's where this stands as of today. New satellite radar and GPS data have confirmed that Campi Flegrei's ongoing ground uplift and the earthquakes accompanying it, including July's record-setting magnitude 4.7 event, are centered not on land, but roughly 500 meters offshore beneath the Bay of Naples, with individual earthquakes leaving measurable, coastline-reaching deformation signatures that satellite imagery can now detect and map in detail. A newly published deformation-driven model has found that this caldera's earthquake swarms are governed by cumulative ground uplift rather than simple elapsed time, a genuinely significant shift in how scientists understand and forecast this system's behavior going forward. And ancient physical evidence, visible today in the marine-scarred columns of the Megaquake of Pozzuoli, proves this exact coastline has undergone this same fundamental process of rising and sinking for thousands of years, long before satellites existed to measure it precisely. I'll be watching for whether this year's uplift rate holds steady, accelerates, or begins to slow, since the newest research suggests that specific number, more than the raw earthquake count, is now the figure most directly tied to what happens next. If breakdowns like this help you understand the real measured science behind a headline like this one, subscribe, because I'll have the update the moment this data meaningfully shifts. I'll see you in the next one.